Time usually marches in a straight, obedient line, 1 second neatly following the next. But every so often, a fracture appears, a seam, a door hiding inside an ordinary moment. Step through, and memory echoes forward, greeting moments that haven't yet arrived. The future loops back to meet you, and the familiar becomes just slightly, unmistakably wrong. Welcome, traveler, to the door between 2 seconds. Step carefully. The moment you entered is already behind you. The first time Mark saw the door, he blamed the camera. It showed up on frame 172 of a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. He was at his desk in the basement security office, the way he was most days, floating in the pale glow of 8 aging monitors and the soft hum of a building that pretended to be more modern than it was. The screens showed every corridor, elevator, stairwell, and lobby of the Coleridge Finance building, a concrete box pretending to have a soul. The feeds were all in tasteful grayscale, not because anyone liked aesthetics, but because the CCTV system was old and cheap and they'd never upgraded. Mark was reviewing a time-stamped sequence from the 3rd floor east corridor, hunting for evidence of a complaint about suspicious loitering. The complaint, as usual, had come from someone who didn't know the difference between loitering and waiting for your lunch delivery. The corridor looked like every corridor in the building. Smooth gray walls, fluorescent lights humming overhead, abstract corporate art that looked like someone had blurred the concept of a landscape. He clicked forward, frame by frame. A man in a polo shirt appeared, stopped, checked his phone, shifted his weight. Mark was already half bored. Frame 169. The man glanced up the hall. Frame 170. The man checked his watch. Frame 171. Empty stretch of corridor beyond him, just the elevator doors and the fire extinguisher. Frame 172. There, in the middle of the hallway, where there had been nothing at all, stood a door. Not a fire door, not an office door, something else entirely. It was an old wooden thing, for one, dark-stained, with a frosted glass panel set into the upper half, glowing faintly white. The frame around it didn't quite touch the floor or ceiling. It just hung there, somehow planted in the air but casting a thin shadow as if it were solid. No number on it, no handle visible from this angle. It was only there for that single frame. Frame 173, nothing again, just hallway, just elevator, just regular stupid reality. Mark stared at the screen and then blinked hard as if he could unsee it by brute force. He flicked backward, scrolling with his fingers slow and careful. Frame 169, 170, 171, hallway, frame 172, door, frame 173, hallway. He leaned in until his nose nearly touched the glass. The door wasn't even properly in focus because the camera hadn't adjusted. It had appeared too fast for the lens to understand. But the door was there, the frosted glass glowing, the edges slightly haloed like an overexposed piece of film that had wandered into the wrong movie. Mark checked the system logs. No glitches reported, no dropped frames. He rewound further. The door had not been there before. He jumped ahead. Later that day, nothing. Later that night, nothing. A week before, nothing. Frame 172, Tuesday, 11:43:02 a.m. 1/60th of a second, captured and pinned to a digital timeline containing something that shouldn't exist. He told himself he was tired, that the old software was rendering artifacts, that maybe a reflection or overlay or some stupid internal test pattern had bled into the recording. He told himself all this firmly, repeatedly. Then he printed the frame anyway. The printed image came out of the office laser printer in washed-out monotone, lines barely holding together. The door looked stranger on paper, somehow more real, less like a glitch, more like something that had been photographed and then misfiled into his life. He pinned the picture to the corkboard next to his desk, between the emergency evacuation map and a cartoon about budget cuts someone had printed 6 months ago. Then he sat back in his chair and tried to get on with the day. He almost succeeded. Almost. By Thursday, Mark had found the door 3 more times. Different floors, different cameras, different days, though always around the same minute, 11:43 a.m., the building's weird dead hour when the morning rush slowed, but the lunch exodus hadn't begun. In one clip, it appeared at the far end of the ground floor corridor by the vending machines. In another, it flickered into existence between 2 conference room doors as a woman carrying a stack of files walked past without any sign she noticed it. In another, it hovered at an angle in the lobby, slightly off plumb, as if trying to remember what straight meant. Always 1 frame, never 2. Frame 172, frame 172, frame 172. Mark started leaving his lunch microwaving while he scrubbed footage, eyes burning from grayscale. He told no one. What did you even say? Hey, boss, there's a ghost door in our cameras. Hey, Bob, remember that training module on reporting suspicious activity? Is portal to elsewhere on the list? He spent his breaks staring at the printouts he'd made and tacking new ones beside them like a detective, slowly losing an argument with reality. The doors were all the same door, same wood, same frosted glass, same ghostly glow. But their shadows shifted, changing with the angle of whatever light or reality they'd been carelessly dropped into. No one else came close to that corkboard. No one else saw. On Friday at 11:41 a.m., Mark left his desk. There was no dramatic music, no heavy breath, no gripping of the armrests, no whispered vow. He simply stood up, as if to get more coffee, and instead walked to the elevator. He told himself he was curious, that's all. The elevator hummed. Its panel buttons glowed flat, indifferent red. He rode to the 3rd floor east corridor, because that was where he'd first seen it. He checked his watch, 11:42 a.m. He stepped out into the familiar softness of carpet and the smell of reheated food from distant break rooms. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, singing their endless white noise hymn to corporate life. The walls were the same pale gray in person as on screen, and it mildly offended him that this felt like stepping into his own monitors. He walked to the middle of the hall, where the camera's perspective said the door should be. He felt ridiculous. He stood there, between 2 abstract paintings that looked like they were about to apologize for existing, and he tried to decide whether he wanted this to work or not. His watch ticked, 11:42, 52, 5, 6, 7. He didn't know exactly where frame 172 lined up in his own experience of time. All he knew was that at 11:43:02, somewhere inside the camera's machinery, a sliver of existence had held something impossible. He watched the second hand crawl nearer. A woman from accounting walked past behind him, heels clicking. She gave him a glance that translated cleanly to maintenance weirdos, and kept going. 11:42:59, 11:43 tried. Nothing happened. He exhaled slowly, not sure if it was relief or disappointment. The second hand ticked again, 11:43:01. The hallway flickered. It was subtle, like the room had blinked and reopened its eyes a fraction misaligned. The hum of the fluorescent lights flattened into a thin-held note. The air thickened, like it had been very slowly replaced with something more hesitant. 11:43:02. There it was. The door stood right in front of him, exactly where the empty space had been, so suddenly and so naturally that part of his brain insisted it must have been there all along. It didn't erupt into being. It simply began to be noticed. The frosted glass shone with a milky radiance too soft to hurt, too bright to ignore. The wood of the frame looked old but well-kept, its edges sharp, the grain visible beneath the stain. The door didn't connect to any wall. Its frame simply rose from nothing and pierced nothing, standing in the middle of the corridor like a punchline that hadn't apologized yet. The air around it bent slightly, like heat over asphalt. but without warmth. Mark glanced behind him. The corridor was still there, but distant, like it had slipped a few feet away while he wasn't looking. Colors, or shades of gray, rather, had flattened. The corporate art on the wall had smudged at the edges, as if someone had dragged their thumb through wet charcoal. Time itself felt grainy, layered, like he was moving through a film reel instead of a moment. He looked back at the door. There was a handle now. He hadn't seen one in the footage, but here it was. A simple brushed metal bar on his side, cool and ordinary, the kind of thing you'd find on an office door. The kind of thing that beckoned you with familiarity even when everything else screamed no. He reached out, hand shaking just enough for him to notice, and closed his fingers around it. The metal was cold, real. There was no dramatic rumble when he turned it, no thunderclap, no feeling of God clearing his throat. The door simply clicked, opened, and let him in. He stepped through the doorway between 2 seconds and found himself in a room that did not exist. It felt like an office that had been half remembered and then painted in monochrome dreams. The walls were there, but not there, long planes of dim, smoky gray that seemed to exist only because light needed somewhere to stop. No corners, just soft curves where wall met floor met ceiling, the geometry unsure and shy. The floor under his feet felt solid but didn't echo. Each step absorbed itself, quiet as an apology. Above him, there were no lights he could see, yet everything glowed gently, as if the entire air had decided to be responsible for illumination. The door behind him closed with a soft, final snick. When he turned, he saw the back of it. The same dark wood, the same frosted glass, but this side showed no handle. Only smooth surface and the faintest suggestion of figures moving behind the glass, like shadows from someone else's film. He took a breath that tasted like the inside of a projector. Dust, old stories, a faint electric tang. "Hello," he said, because human beings are relentlessly predictable. His voice didn't echo. It just went a short distance and then sat down, as if tired. "Mark," said a voice. He froze, because it was his own voice. He turned around slowly. Across the room, a man sat at a metal desk, hunched over a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like forms. The desk was old and utilitarian, the kind you rescued from schools that no longer existed. A vintage rotary phone sat beside a small lamp that didn't need to be on, and yet it was. The man wore Mark's face, a little thinner, a little more tired around the eyes, as if he'd had a longer week. But the curve of the jaw, the way his left eyebrow arched slightly when thinking, the little crease near the mouth, those were all Mark. The other Mark didn't look surprised to see him. If anything, he looked mildly relieved. "You made it just under the wire," the man said, setting his pen down. "Good. I hate doing this part without you." Mark swallowed. "Without me?" "Yeah." The man gestured to a chair opposite the desk. Mark hadn't noticed it until that moment, but of course it was there. "Sit. It's going to get noisy." Mark sat. The chair was exactly as uncomfortable as every office chair he'd ever had. The man across from him studied him for a moment and then nodded to himself. "This version of you always looks the most tired," he said conversationally. "Not sure why. Maybe the lighting back there." There was a moment of silence in which Mark tried to decide whether he was dreaming, hallucinating, dead, or had finally reached the combinatorial endpoint of boredom. "You're me," he said. "Exactly what I'd say." The man slid a stack of papers over. The top sheet was blank. The rest might as well have been too. Faint lines, spaces where words should go. "Okay, let's see where we are." Mark looked around the room instead. There were walls, yes, and a ceiling. But there were also cutouts. That was the only way he could think of them. Windows that weren't quite windows. Rectangular shapes hanging in the air at various heights and angles, each filled with some flickering scene. Some were black and white, some were sepia-toned, some had the faint wash of modern digital color that looked wrong here. In one floating frame, Mark saw himself sitting in a coffee shop he'd never been to, laughing with a woman he didn't recognize. In another, he was standing on a stage, squinting into lights, holding a microphone with a confidence he did not possess in his actual life. In another, he wore a mechanic's jumpsuit, grease on his cheek, talking to a teenager in a driveway next to a half-repaired car. He stared. "Don't get distracted," the other Mark said mildly. "We'll get to those." "What is this?" Mark asked, voice thin. "Where am I? Who are you?" "I am you, but not this you," the man said. "You are you, but not that you. This is the office between your seconds, and you're here because you kept looking at the camera long after most people would have gone to lunch." "That's not an answer." The other Mark shrugged. "It's the only one anyone ever gives me." One of the floating frames crackled softly, like film slipping in a projector. For a moment, the room smelled strongly of rain on asphalt and burnt popcorn. "You're not making sense," Mark said. "This is a dream, a stress thing. I spend too much time with grainy footage and bad lighting. I probably passed out at my desk." "If it helps you to think that, you can hang on to it for a while," the other Mark said. "But we have work to do, and the frames don't wait." "What frames?" The other Mark gestured at the floating scenes. "Those. Every time you almost did something but didn't. Every left instead of right. Every I'll do it later. Every door you didn't walk through." Mark watched as one of the rectangles settled into sharper focus. There he was again, himself in his mid-20s this time, hair thicker, eyes less resigned, standing outside a small storefront with a for lease sign. Younger him was holding a set of keys, looking at the sign, looking at his phone, then at the dark interior through the glass. He took a deep breath, thumb hovering over the keypad to call someone, and then he put the keys in his pocket, turned away, and walked out of frame. The rectangle froze. "What was that?" Mark asked, throat dry. "That," the other Mark said, "was the day you almost signed a lease to open a little repair shop of your own. You'd been talking about it for years. You'd done the math 100 times. You'd even picked out the name, remember?" Mark did. He had not thought of it in a decade, but the words surfaced clean and aching. Second chance repairs. "You didn't do it," the other Mark continued. "You went back to the desk job. Told yourself you'd try again next year. You never did." The room hummed. Another rectangle flickered awake. This time Mark was older, about his current age, standing outside the door to his supervisor's office, holding a sealed envelope. His shoulders were tense but determined. "You wrote your resignation letter," the other Mark said. "You printed it, signed it, even walked all the way up to hand it in." Mark watched himself hesitate outside the office door. He listened to nothing for a long moment, then stuffed the envelope into his jacket and walked away. "You didn't go in," the other Mark said. "You never did." Mark felt something ugly and familiar in his chest, like regret finding an old path. "What is this place?" he asked again. The question sounded smaller this time. "This is where all your almosts come to be counted," the other Mark said simply. "Not judged. No one has that kind of time. Just tallied, filed, noted." "For what?" "For you." Mark shook his head. "That doesn't make any sense. I didn't do those things. They didn't happen." The other Mark gave him a look he recognized, the look he'd given security footage 1,000 times, seeing what people insisted hadn't occurred. "They almost happened," he said. "And almost is not nothing. It's weight. You're feeling it even back there. That heaviness you call tired, that's accumulation." He flipped through the stack of papers in front of him. As he did, some of the floating frames brightened or dimmed, as if reacting. Some people barely generate any. They decide fast. They regret, sure. but they don't linger. Their almosts are light, a few flashes, easy to file. He looked at Mark with something like pity. You linger. Mark wanted to argue, but his memory unhelpfully began lining up every time he'd told himself he'd change soon. The gym membership that became a monthly donation. The online courses bookmarked and never started. The conversations he'd almost had. The apology he'd never made. The proposal he'd almost asked. He swallowed. So what happens here? He asked quietly. The other Mark tapped the papers. Depends. Usually nothing. We tally. We file. You go back. You keep adding weight until you run out of seconds and then... well... He shrugged. That's someone else's department. Usually, Mark repeated carefully. What about... not usually? The other Mark studied him, eyes narrowing, and Mark had the nauseating realization that this man, or thing wearing his face, knew him more intimately than he knew himself. Sometimes, the other Mark said slowly, someone steps through the door early, before it's scheduled, before they've reached quota. That's unusual. Mark let out a short laugh that sounded like it belonged to a stranger. Quota. You think we open doors into between time for every midlife crisis? The other Mark asked. You have to earn it. Earn it how? By almost living 1,000 different lives and never quite committing to any of them. The words landed with a soft, devastating accuracy. Mark looked at the nearest floating frame. In it, he was sitting on a train, backpack at his feet, staring at a map. A younger version of him, with the nervous excitement of a person who had just bought a ticket leaving the country without a return date. He watched as that younger Mark took a call, smiled tightly, nodded, and then got off at the next stop, carrying his backpack straight back into a life that wouldn't ask too many questions. He remembered that one. The job offer that had come in just as he'd been about to leave. The way he'd told himself, I'll work there for a year, save more, then go. He never went. Why are you showing me this? Mark asked, suddenly angry. So I can feel worse? That's a hell of a performance review. The other Mark seemed genuinely puzzled. You came here, he pointed out. You watched the frames. You stood in the hall at the right second. You put your hand on the handle. You opened the door. I didn't drag you. I didn't know what it was. You knew enough. Curiosity is just regret with better PR. Mark bristled. So what now? You parade my almosts in front of me until what? I crumble? I repent? I promise to do better? The other Mark sighed, looking tired in a way that went beyond physical. Let me simplify this, he said. Every time you almost choose a different life and don't, that life doesn't vanish. It exists here as potential, weighty, real, but unrealized. This room is where they're archived. You are unusually prolific. You've generated enough almosts to bend your seconds. He gestured around. That's why you saw the door. Most people never build enough pressure. You, on the other hand. He trailed off. So you're telling me I'm indecisive, and that's cosmic now, Mark said. You want it to sound small, the other Mark said, so you can keep living like it is. But you're here, which means you don't actually believe that anymore. The room dimmed slightly, or maybe it didn't. Maybe Mark's attention simply narrowed. One of the frames floated closer of its own accord. In it, he recognized last Tuesday at his own desk. He saw himself leaning close to a monitor, pausing on a single frame of footage. There, the door. His eyes widening a fraction, his hand reaching for the print button, and almost widened around him like a halo. If you walk back out now, the other Mark said quietly, you'll remember this like a vivid daydream, a strange thought you had at work once, something you almost told someone but didn't. It'll flatten over time, fold into the rest of your maybe tomorrows. And if I don't walk back out? Mark asked, heart thudding. The other Mark leaned back in his chair, regarding him. Then you pick one, he said. One what? One life you almost lived, the other mark said. One frame. You stepped through it, instead of back into the corridor. You live that instead. You don't get all of them. No one does. But you'd stop carrying around the weight of all of these as if they were still possible. Mark looked up at the shifting gallery of lives he hadn't had. The coffee shop with the stranger who laughed at his jokes without knowing his history. The repair shop with its oil-stained floor and the small neon sign flickering in the window. The stage with the microphone and the blinding lights and the feeling of saying something that mattered to people who wanted to hear it. The apartment in a city he'd only ever seen online, where the windows overlooked a river and the nights hummed differently. He felt something sour rise in him. You're telling me I can just step into one of those? He asked. That I abandon everything, everyone? People back there think I exist. Some of them do, the other mark agreed. The building will still stand. The cameras will still hum. The boss will still underpay someone. They'll get a new mark or they won't. Either way, time slides forward. But my life, Mark protested. My apartment, my routines, the stupid plants I keep killing, the 3 co-workers I don't hate, all the little things. Little things are still things, the other mark said gently. I'm not minimizing them. I'm just telling you the account is currently overdrawn. You've been storing up interest on lives you never check out. And if I stay? Mark insisted. If I go back through that door and keep trying, be better, choose more, whatever moral of the story you're leading me to. Then these all stay here, the other mark said, gesturing at the frames. They don't haunt you anymore. You know you've seen them. They become reference material. You go back, and maybe you finally buy a ticket and don't answer the phone. Maybe you sign something. Maybe you quit something. Maybe you don't. That's on you. I don't get to see beyond that door. So, you don't know what happens if I go back. Nobody does, the other mark said. Once you leave this room, we stop adding new entries. The door doesn't open twice for the same timeline. You get one audit. Mark laughed again, but the sound cracked. You're telling me all of this with the certainty of a bureaucrat who's been at this forever, and then you shrug at the ending. Every system has limits, the other mark said. I file almosts. Outcomes are somebody else's headache. Mark stood up. The room shifted slightly in response, like a spotlight following him. Several frames drifted nearer, their images sharpening. In one, he saw himself older, hair thinner, shoulders rounded, sitting alone in his small apartment. The TV glowed in front of him, but he wasn't looking at it. He was staring at nothing, lips moving slightly as if arguing with himself. A stack of unopened mail sat on the table. The air looked stale. He flinched away. In another, he saw himself behind a counter, hands stained with oil, laughing with a customer over a shared complaint about cars and the way they chose their moments to die. There were small potted plants in the window, most of them still alive. A hand-painted sign on the wall read, "Second Chance Repairs. We fix what they gave up on." He almost stepped toward that frame before stopping. In another, he saw himself at the building security office, but things were slightly different. There were sticky notes on the monitor edges with scribbled jokes. A co-worker stood beside him, gesturing animatedly, clearly telling a story. He was listening, really listening, fully present. There was no door on the screen. The corkboard behind him held travel brochures, none of them pinned with anything sharp enough to be an excuse. "That one," he said quietly, nodding. The other mark followed his gaze. "Ah," he said, "that's an almost 2. "It looks like my life now," Mark said. "Almost," the other mark corrected. "In that thread, you made a small change one Tuesday. You answered a message instead of ignoring it. You said yes to a drink instead of, 'I'm tired.' You let one thing lead to another. You didn't walk past the door every day thinking you missed it. You hardly noticed it at all because you were busy living something. Mark's throat tightened. So even my life as it is an almost of something better. The other Mark tilted his head. It's an almost of something different, he said. Better is a weasel word. Mark stood in the center of the room, surrounded by fragments of lives that could have been his. The repair shop, the train ticket, the stage, the small incremental differences that turned into larger ones, friendships that stuck because he watered them, choices that grew roots because he didn't yank them out the second they looked like effort. He realized, with a slow, bruising clarity, that he'd spent his entire adult life treating the future like a storage unit for the person he might someday be. "Why does this even exist?" he asked, voice barely audible. "Why give me a choice like this?" The other Mark considered. "Because sometimes," he said, "a human being becomes so heavy with almosts that reality has to do something with the overflow. Most people disperse it slowly. Regrets leak out in bitter jokes and quiet sighs and late-night what-ifs. But sometimes, in rare cases, there's a condensation. A door." "Exactly," the other Mark said. "It shows up in the quiet part of their routine. Not in a crisis, not in a fire, not when they're already running. In the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. A door between 2 seconds, both of which could look exactly the same if they choose not to see it." "And you," Mark said slowly, "are what? The clerk?" The other Mark smiled faintly. "I process the backlog. I offer the audit. I'm what you'd be if you'd taken this job seriously from the beginning." Mark waited for a punchline. None came. He looked back at the door he'd entered through. It now stood slightly ajar, the frosted glass opaque. He could see the blurred outline of his own corridor beyond it, like a memory of a place rather than the place itself. "If I go back," he said, "you said the door doesn't open again." "For this line," the other Mark nodded. "For this Mark." "How would I remember this?" "Maybe you don't," the other Mark said. "Maybe it fades. Maybe you remember it as a feeling you can't shake. A billboard you keep passing that says, 'This was almost something else.' That's not helpful." "I file almost," the other Mark said. "Not self-help manuals." Silence hummed. Somewhere in the room, a frame crackled and blew out, going dark. The space it left behind felt lighter, as if some decision had finally given up waiting. Mark closed his eyes. He thought about the repair shop, the satisfaction of fixing something broken with his hands, the fatigue at the end of a day that came from doing instead of sitting. He thought about the stage, the heartbeat in his throat, the connection through a microphone, saying something that might matter. He thought about the train, the feeling of leaving without knowing what came next. He thought about his actual life, the steady paycheck, the health insurance, the worn-out coffee mug, the familiar click of the security cameras cycling through views he knew too well, the 3 co-workers he did not hate, the nights spent staring at a screen, scrolling through lives other people seemed to be living. "You said if I stay, I pick one almost and step into it," he said quietly. "If I go back, I get no promises." "That's correct," the other Mark said. "And if I step into one of these," he said, gesturing at the frames, "I forget all the others?" "Not at first," the other Mark said. "But memory adjusts. It has to. Humans aren't built to hold this many parallel disappointments. You'd forget most of them. Maybe remember a few as strange dreams." "That sounds merciful," Mark said. "It's efficient," the other Mark replied. "Mercy is an accidental side effect." Mark approached the frame with the repair shop. The sign in the window flickered, a warm, stubborn glow. Second Chance Repairs. He could almost smell the oil, feel the weight of a wrench, hear the mutter of a radio playing some station he'd never bothered to change. "You always pause at that one," the other Mark said softly. "Across many variants, it's one of your loudest almosts." Many variants, Mark repeated. How many Mark versions do you handle? Just the ones that open the door, the other Mark said. It's not my fault you're a rerun. Anger sparked again, small and bright. If I step into this, Mark said, nodding at the repair shop, do I become the version of me that rented that space 15 years ago? For you, it would be now, the other Mark said. You'd wake up in the life in progress, with its regrets, its bills, its joys, its fights, its worn-out shoes. You don't get to skip to the happy montage. You land where that Mark is, not where you think you deserve to be. So I'm trading one pile of almosts for another, Mark said. The question, the other Mark said, is whether you'd like the shape of them better. The room felt smaller suddenly, the choices closer. He thought of something then, small and stupid from years ago. Being 15, standing outside a girl's house with a mixtape in his pocket and a speech in his head, never ringing the doorbell. Going home, telling himself it didn't matter. Carrying that almost through every attempt to start something with someone new. He realized, with dawning horror, that his life had been a string of not ringing doorbells. He stepped back from the repair shop frame. The other Mark watched, expression unreadable. Mark turned toward the real door, or the original door, the one that led back to fluorescent lights and the hum of the building and the stack of printouts on his corkboard. You're going back, the other Mark said. It wasn't a question. Mark nodded once. You understand you're declining the guaranteed alternate, the other Mark said. You're choosing uncertainty with full knowledge of what you've almost done. Yes, Mark said. His voice shook, but the word didn't. Why? Because, Mark said slowly, I don't want this to be the place where I finally make a decision. I don't want to outsource my life to a room that keeps score on things I was too scared to do. I want my next choice to be something I actually live through, not something I step into like a pre-owned car. The other Mark stared at him for a long moment. Then, to Mark's surprise, he smiled. Not the thin, corporate politeness they both used. A small, real curve of the mouth that reached the eyes. You're the first one to phrase it like that, he said. I'm not allowed to approve or disapprove. But if I were, I'd call that a decent answer. You said the door won't open again, Mark said. How do I remember enough to do something different? You won't remember the details, the other Mark said. But the weight will be gone. These almost will be filed, not carried. When you go back, you'll feel lighter and more terrified. It's a useful combination. He stood up too, the chair scraping soundlessly against the floor that wasn't exactly there. You should know, he added, that your seconds will feel wider, like there's more room in them. Some people find that unbearable. Some find it exhilarating. What do you think I'll find? Mark asked. The other Mark shrugged. I file almosts, he repeated. I don't predict outcomes. They stood facing each other, two versions of the same man separated by choices and a doorway. Is this goodbye, then? Mark asked. The other Mark tilted his head. You like to imagine everything as a grand farewell or a missed opportunity, he said. This is neither. This is a moment. You're good at missing those. Try not to miss this one. Mark turned toward the door. The frosted glass from this side showed only a faint impression of the corridor. He could see a blurred shape, himself maybe, standing where he'd been moments ago. The edges of the frame shimmered, restless. His hand hovered over where the handle should be. For a heartbeat, he considered stepping into one of the other frames instead, trading one set of habits for a fresh batch of failures. There was an odd comfort in that, to know at least what story you were walking into, even if you didn't know the ending. He didn't. He pushed where the handle wasn't, and the door opened anyway. The corridor snapped back into place around him like a rubber band. The lights hummed. The walls were as dull gray as ever. The air tasted of microwaved leftovers and commercial-grade cleaning supplies. The door, behind him, was gone. He checked his watch. 11:43:03 a.m. A second had passed. His heart hammered against his ribs as if trying to remind him he still had one. A woman from accounting walked past, giving him the same vaguely judgmental look as before, but this time she tacked on, "You okay? You look like you just saw a ghost." He began. He realized he didn't remember the room's details anymore. Not clearly, just impressions, frames in the air, the sense of weight, his own voice talking back to him, a feeling like he'd been given full disclosure on something he couldn't fully recall. "I think," he said slowly, surprising himself, "I just decided to take my lunch on time today." She laughed politely, not understanding, and walked on. Mark stood in the corridor for a moment longer, breathing. He felt lighter. Not euphoric, not cleansed, just less compressed. As if someone had taken the tight coil of maybe next year from his chest and filed it somewhere it belonged more than inside him. He went back down to the security office. The monitors glowed, familiar and flat. The footage cycled. Frame 169, 170, 171, 172. He paused. Frame 172 now showed an empty hallway. The door was gone from the recording, as if it had never been there, as if he'd imagined it, as if everything he'd just experienced had happened entirely inside the thin strip of time between two boring frames of corporate video. His corkboard was still there, with the printouts pinned to it. Only now the pins were in a neat straight line, holding up blank sheets of paper. He stared at them. He didn't remember printing anything else. He didn't remember when he'd decided to put them up at all. For a moment, panic flared. Did I make it up? Did I just have a moment? Am I losing it? But beneath that, quieter and steadier, something else sat. A sense that the next time he almost did a thing, it would tug differently. That later wouldn't feel as safe. That maybe would itch. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. A message from one of the other guards, Tom, flashed on the screen. "Hey, we're grabbing a drink after shift at Murphy's. You in or nah?" Normally, Mark would have typed, "Nah, I'm beat. Rain check." Then he'd go home, watch something he didn't care about, scroll until his eyes hurt, and tell himself he was too tired to make a different choice. His thumb hovered over the keyboard. It wasn't a big moment. It didn't feel cinematic. There was no music, no slow zoom. In the monitors, the hallway on the third floor remained stubbornly ordinary. Mark typed, "Yeah, I'm in. Don't let them order mozzarella sticks before I get there." Tom replied with a thumbs up and a bad joke about cheese, because of course he did. Mark smiled. He took the printouts down from the corkboard. The pins left tiny, precise holes. He stacked the blank pages neatly, even though there was nothing on them, and slid them into the shredder. The machine whirred, chewing their emptiness into strips. On the way home later, he passed by a strip of shuttered storefronts he'd never really noticed before. One had a for lease sign in the window, dust gathering on the sill. He stopped and looked at it for longer than made sense. His heart beat once, twice, in his throat. He took a picture of the sign, not as a someday, as a note. There would still be almosts. There always were. Doors he wouldn't open, trains he wouldn't board, calls he wouldn't make. That was the texture of being human. But somewhere, filed in a room he couldn't remember, a backlog had been cleared. His seconds stretched just a little wider, and as he started walking again, he had the distinct, inexplicable feeling that somewhere between two frames of security footage, a man who looked like him picked up a pen, wrote "closed," audited at the bottom of a long list of entries, and smiled, just a little,